Hate to see it botched? Here's the best bits, a Botching It Up podcast short clip.
The most successful children's literature becomes world famous. It transcends adult literature, film, culture, and entertainment to become like just a roller coaster of money. We're talking Harry Potter, we're talking Roald Dahl, things like that. And I think a lot about why this happens and why these things just blow away out of success and literally the entire world goes to see them. And it's basically because they play on adult themes but dress it up in fantasy. And if you get that distinction wrong, it doesn't make people feel that primal emotion that they should confront with children's literature, which is fear and scares. And because what children's literature basically does is play on the primal emotions of human beings, dress it up in a way that it's acceptable, not only acceptable for the whole family, but you can sort of ingest it without consciously necessarily realizing what you are eating.
Yeah, you can enjoy it on face service, but you can also enjoy it on the themes that are stated deeper within.
It's such a fine line between getting that right and wrong. And I tried all day to think of a different metaphor, maybe more suited to wrestling, that would adhere to this point. But basically what I'm saying is Ric Flair literally does that. And that's why I think he's the greatest of all time. The subtleties and distinction between Carneyland and reality for Ric Flair are so minute, I can't even really go into detail of how he achieves them. Take his entrance again, Ric Flair versus Harley Race, Starrcade 1983. It's the most magnificent entrance I've ever seen. The lights are black for 5-6 minutes. You start to hear that theme tune. And when you think he's coming out, he doesn't. And it just builds and builds and builds. And there's streamers, and there's a spotlight on him, and he walks in, and the crowd goes mad. He's also the most serious-faced man I've ever seen. And it's Flair, sometimes, you must have seen it watching all your matches, sometimes when he comes down, usually when he's playing face, he comes down with the most serious look, like taping his fingers to show that he's a Mac technician. Things like that, which are deadly serious and go back to the idea of amateur wrestling and a real fight. But then I'm sure that you're seeing just as much as me that he shows his ass a lot. He plays up. He flip-flops on the floor. He does his face flop spot.
Yep.
He gets thrown onto the floor trying to do a top turnbuckle almost every match. He plays comedy spots continuously while somehow still being that Rolex-wearing serious motherfucker that you don't want to mess with. The way he intermingles comedy and seriousness, ridiculousness and prestige, I think that is why Ric Flair is the greatest wrestler of all time. I'm sorry for that children's literature metaphor, but there is literally no other way I could figure to phrase it.
Yeah, you're right, man. He's hit a very perfect balance of being a player, but then also being the most legitimate champion in the game.
When you think about how he puts all of those things together without making himself look stupid, at least we're talking like the 80s, 90s here, it seems almost impossible. The fineness of when he decides to go for a butt spot, when he decides to show that he's turned up to be the most serious in the game, and to the point that the crowd and the audience don't notice which one's which and why. And it becomes a 3D character, despite the fact that there's so many irregularities within those two different personalities. I can't even comprehend how that's achieved so naturally.
What I find amazing is not only that he achieved that, but he got to that stage so quickly in his career. It feels like there's not a lot of content out there where he's just the mid card trying to find himself, trying to build his character. It seems like in the late 70s, he was discovering the woo, he was taking on the nature boy persona. And then in the early 80s, bam, he's now in contention with Harley Race for the NWA Championship. And it seems like it was almost 0 to 100 straight out the gate.
And for the rest of his career, really.
Yeah, but that's what I mean. He got to that level so quick and so fast. It's almost unbelievable.
And stayed there. But that's the another major thing about Ric Flair. He stayed there. I don't know whether it's pointed or not, or whether he meant to, but his timing throughout his history seems almost impeccable. The way he understood the territory system and the way that kept him fresh for a long period of time almost took him. He almost used the same mentality on TV. Like if you look at his last WWE run, he came in as a fight for control over the power of WWE with Vince, whatever.
Yeah.
He went from general manager to Undertaker. He threw himself onto the biggest name in the business at that time, which was Triple H. And I'm sure Triple H would love to think that Triple H threw himself onto Flair. But I think Flair knew what he was doing,
That,
confidence or not.
that's definitely how they play it off nowadays, isn't it? But
Yeah, I'm pretty sure Flair knows a thing or two, and a lot more of a thing or two than Triple H about how to stay relevant, given his history.
yeah, how to get the most TV time.
He immediately gave himself another 4 years, not just by being with Triple H, but by being with incredibly young guys who had a lot of potential. He suddenly was able to offshoot into Randy Orton if he wanted to, Batista if he wanted to. He had years of storylines with these guys without even really trying. 2006 obviously was a bit of a low year from what I can see. Like he sort of became that legend past his prime and he was winning championships with like Roddy Piper or whatever. But then he went straight into almost, again, a massive gimmick, which was every match was his last chance match. And then he went into his retirement. And it's just like, I wouldn't even call it politicking. Like he just manages to take that territorial mentality and somehow find himself fresh-faced within the same company.
Yeah.
Which seems impossible when you look at today's entertainment.
Yeah. Without knowing the man, I would argue that he enjoyed his time in the territories far more than he did with WWF. If we look at his first run in WWF, it looks like it was filled with either conflicting creative ideas or he wasn't allowed to be himself. He wasn't allowed to be the guy that he was 5 years earlier in the NWA.
Oh yeah, I'd probably agree. I mean that's something I've never quite understood. I assumed that there was an argument with Vince, but that was a really short WWE run, wasn't it?
Yeah, so this was because WCW wanted him to change his gimmick. Quite famously now, they wanted him to play Spartacus, and he...
What? I've never heard this story.
You never heard this?
No.
So when WCW, I think this is basically around the time WCW were basically splitting up from NWA. And
so this is like 1991?
yeah, this is really early 90s.
Okay.
And they want a fresh new image, not only for the company, but for all of their new stars. And they wanted Ric Flair to basically have a gladiator Spartacus gimmick.
Wow.
And Ric Flair knew that that was a death sentence. So the guy that was running WCW was in contract negotiations for Ric Flair. Ric Flair wanted more money, and also he wanted to have basically creative freedom, I guess the guys would call it nowadays, but back then he just wanted to keep his character. So contract negotiations failed. Ric Flair jumped shit over to WWF, and the same situation happened there. He had no control. Vince wanted control over him, so he jumped back to WCW, where now it was a whole different regime controlling the show, and they wanted the classic legendary Ric Flair to continue being himself. That's basically what happened in those 3-4 years.
That's a crazy story. I've never heard of somebody trying to repackage Ric Flair. That's really mental.
It's unbelievable, really, especially in the early 90s after a decade of Ric Flair being on top, that you'd want to change anything about him.
Going back to organic timing, with him kind of always seeming to be in the right place at the right time, that did more for his stock than anything, man. I'm pretty sure he left WCW while he was still NWA World Champion, walked into WWE, was World Champion there within a year, and then walked out like 6 months after being WWE World Champion, and a year after winning the Royal Rumble from starting at number 1. The point I'm making is Flair somehow has survived 30 years in a wrestling business, but never lost either his credibility while he was a full-time wrestler or his esteem. Like, he was always coming out of a championship reign, which is a joke now. But when he moved companies, when he moved territories, that's why he sold so many tickets. Like the idea that somebody can walk into WWE for 2 years, become champion, win the Royal Rumble from number one, and then leave again, go straight into a world championship program with another company. It's unheard of.
He walked into the WWF with the big gold NWA belt, and the story was that he is the real world champion and that he wants to take on the WWF champion to prove once and for all which belt is better. I just love that back in those days things like this could happen.
Like, share, and subscribe to keep it botched up, brother.